Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, the podcast for writers who strive to be bold and readers who crave something new. I'm your host, Jonathan Ball. I want to thank you for being here, and I want us to stay in touch. So subscribe to this podcast, then go to writingthewrongway.com and enter your best email to receive the Martian Embassy Missive, my bi-weekly newsletter where I let you know what's happening on Mars, where we're always making big plans. Join the Martians so you don't get left out of the invasion at writingthewrongway.com. And as a special bonus, I'll send you a free book. Speaking of books, my new book is called The National Gallery, and it contains sonnets about Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, elegies lamenting the death of my iPhone, and other strange missives from yours truly, the Poet Laureate of Hell. Visit thenationalgallery.ca to order your signed copy. That's thenationalgallery.ca. So I'm talking to Anthony Etherin, and Anthony, can you tell us a little bit about yourself as a poet and publisher and the kind of work that you like to do?
Sure. Well, I'm a constraint-based poet, but I really consider myself a formalist, and I consider what I'm doing with alphabet-based constraints as an extension of that. So I suppose I'm best known for writing palindromes and anagrams.
And can you talk a bit about, for people who don't know, what a palindrome or anagram is?
Sure. So an anagram is a phrase which jumbles up the words of another phrase, the letters, in fact. And a palindrome is a phrase that reads the same backwards as forwards by letter. Although there are, as we'll talk about later, there are different ways of writing palindromes that maybe don't involve going backwards by letter.
So then, I mean, you do other types of writing as well, but in addition to writing anagrams and palindromes, you're also doing this in a relatively complicated way, usually, where, say, you'll often, for example, write a sonnet that is, again, a formalist sonnet, observing all the, rhyme scheme, meter, and so on of, say, a Shakespearean sonnet. But then additionally, we'll have maybe a constraint of reading the same backwards and forwards. So like each letter, in sequence, halfway through the poem, starts to proceed in the backwards sequence. So you'll often you will double up the constraints in those sorts of ways. Can we just talk a little bit about, just before anything else, about what attracts you to constraints?
Well, I think it was because I actually started as a formalist writing traditional poems like sonnets before I was ever interested in anagrams and palindromes. And it was when I learned how to write formal poetry that I first got poetry. So before that, I was in a band, a bit like you, and I was writing song lyrics, and I suppose I relied on the music to guide me. And then when I started writing poetry, I was writing free verse, and I just questioned why I was bothering, because it didn't make any sense to me that there was no structure there behind it.
Sure.
So then I started to learn about iambic pentameter and all these different forms that have existed for so long, and I just really got into it. And so then when I started to look at what else was out there in terms of form and what else could guide me, I discovered palindromes, I discovered anagrams. And I think from there, it was just quite a natural step for me to try and combine them with the other poetry I was writing.
Now, I personally don't, when I do poetry, I don't use as many constraints as you do, but I do very much believe in a level of constraint, whether it's visible or not. And when I teach creative writing, the first thing I teach anybody, whether in a creative writing class or in a literature class where they're just studying literature, I'll do the same first lesson, which is when I make them write a descriptive passage, like a paragraph or a few sentences about an orange, but they can't use the letter O. So they can't use the word orange, of course, to describe the object directly. They have to describe it in a roundabout way. They can't describe its color with reference to, orange. They can't say it's round. I mean, all the normal words that they could use that they would normally use to describe an orange, they can't use. So I get them to do this, again, whether it's a creative writing class or a literature class, and the way I sort of move them into a kind of literary mindset, as it were, is by sort of making them notice that because they aren't using the normal language that they would normally use, they have to use a sort of alienated approach and this alienated kind of language. They accidentally, whether they intended to or not, start producing something like poetry. And then I just kind of move off that into like some other lessons. But to me, like there's a level at which that you don't need a constraint necessarily to be producing literature, but the constraint really is an enabling feature that helps you produce literature, even though at the same time it's hard to perform under these constraints. And so I'm curious to know, like, if that is sort of one of the reasons, is that sort of also sort of something that attracts you to being, say, more of a formalist or interested in constraints, or is there some other thing that you find particularly intriguing about constraints?
Well, certainly it's nice not to have to worry about inspiration. I don't have days where I'm sitting at the computer and I'm desperately trying to get this lightning bolt to inspire me, because all I have to do is apply a process. I choose a topic, I decide which constraint I want to use to write about that topic, and then I can just get to work.
It's a puzzle.
So that's very nice.
So it's like a puzzle now, instead of having to
definitely.
Muse strike you or whatnot.
Yeah, and it's having worked in other arts, like as a musician, it's quite nice to have that. It's quite nice to know that like every day, if I want to write a poem, I can. And I think a lot of people will be quite jealous of that fact.
What do you say to people who have feel that somehow putting these constraints on their writing is going to make it harder for them to be creative, and the restrictions are going to limit them?
Well, it's as you said, it also almost automatically becomes poetry once you've applied this process, because you're having to think how you wouldn't normally. And it can actually be quite limiting to have complete freedom, because you really then, you will not be thinking as you, the poet. You'll be thinking as you, the everyday person, and your natural language will come into it, which is fine for certain types of poetry. But the poetry I find more interesting always has that sort of alien element, that alien voice to it that isn't quite a normal human.
When I teach creative writing, I often will ask the students to pay attention to when their writing and things are going well, as a possibly dangerous moment, because so often what I find, generally speaking, is so often when the writing is going well and is easy to do, you're just reproducing things you've seen elsewhere, or that, like, if you're trying to write a short story, for example, and it's just like, oh, these characters are telling me what to do, quote unquote, the way that the characters are talking to me, the characters are just, leading me. So often when I find that happening, it's just they're doing the things I've seen other characters like this do in other books. And it is because I've reproduced a cliche that I think it's natural and it feels recognizable. You had mentioned music. I always go back to when I was in a band and we were having a hard time coming up with a new song once. We were just having this drought where we just couldn't come up with like some good riffs, a good song. And we're just sitting around, like for week after week, just struggling to like come up with a cool new song. Finally, our guitarist like starts riffing. We had two techniques. One is we would start playing numbers out of a phone book. So we would get like power chords and we'd play like, 757, 3503 or something. And just try to like see, could we come up with cool like songs that way? Because we had no better idea. But then I remember distinctly there was one moment where the guitarist started playing this riff. And he's like, hey, check this out. He starts playing this amazing, like simple but really cool riff. And we started jamming this song out off this riff. And all of a sudden, like partway, about an hour into this, of like developing this song, all of a sudden I was like, wait, stop everything. I'm like, that's TNT by AC/DC. And it was note for note, it was TNT. But it seemed to flow so effortlessly, and it sounded like a song. Like if you're, again, from your musician days, you may remember when things are going so well, you're writing a song, but it sounds like you heard the song before. Like it's so natural, it's so clearly a song, and it can be good or it can be dangerous, you know. I find that same thing applies to literature myself, and those constraints can really help, as you put it, because that freedom is just...
Because that's being freedom really is being in art anyway, is being constrained by your unconscious.
Yeah.
Just you're following the whims of your unconscious. And as you point out, your unconscious could have picked up something from elsewhere. Whereas at least you can sort of trust your focused conscious mind to be doing something with so much intent that it isn't borrowed work.
So can we look at a couple of really specific examples from your newest books? You've got a book out called Stray Arts right now, which includes a lot of it's a very long book with a lot of really diverse work in it, and you've organized it in these kind of interesting sections. I'm really interested in a few particular poems here, and I was wondering if you could maybe start with reading these 2 Frankenstein sonnets and tell us a little bit about them. And then maybe we could get a little bit into like how you would actually go about writing a poem like that in a really practical and like straight, like what are the actual techniques you might use? Because as I was saying to you before we kind of started recording here, like I myself don't do a lot of really strict constraints like this, and I'm sometimes at a loss for how to explain to other people how to do them. Although I can give a lot of examples and I can tell them like how it's working, like I myself have had a hard time when I've tried this kind of work, actually figuring out where to start. But if you could read this Frankenstein sonnets maybe as a starting point, that'd be great.
Okay, so this is the palindromic Frankenstein sonnet. Deeds, lives allay me. Man, not law, decide. End loyal rot, civilian, as a god. Parts mix a monster, frets no maker tide. A menace, voltage plate me, rip a rod. Pale soon to rot, stuck carcass, end asleep. Dial sun, age, beggar raven egg of doom. Moored on an idle here, re-rift far creep. I peer, craft fire, were held in anode, room. Mood, fog, Geneva, rage began us, laid. Peel sadness, a crack cuts to rot, noose, lap. Do rap ire, metal peg, at love, Cain made. I trek, a monster frets, no Maxim's trap. Dog, as a nail, I victor lay, old need. Iced Walton, name my all as evil's deed. So shall I talk about that one first?
Yeah, maybe let's talk about that first. So you got 2 sonnets here. So that's the first one is that the first one of the 2 you wrote? I assume you would have to, because the other was an anagram. So when you started working on this particular sonnet, could you just maybe start at the very beginning of like what's your thought process in terms of like deciding to write Frankenstein sonnets? Like where does it first come from that you're going to write sonnets about Frankenstein with these kinds of constraints?
Well, first of all, I love the novel, so I only write about things I'm really passionate about. And it's not the first palindromic sonnet I've written. There are several before, and it seemed like a really cool subject for it because I noticed some words that you could actually use in a palindrome. I think in the last line they've got the mention of Walton, referring to Captain Walton, which backwards is not law. So that helps generate the first line with man, not law, decide, which is kind of the idea behind the whole novel. So, and then writing any palindrome, what I find is because I picked a topic and decided to write a palindrome, I make a list of all the relevant words. And it's quite good fun because a lot of the time you've got very unique nouns to use for each subject. So I make a list of them, then I write them backwards. And I think, well, how would that work? How does this fit? And it was really good writing about Frankenstein because I felt like I was stitching together these small disembodied pieces into something whole. And and then of course it is a sonnet. It's a Shakespearean sonnet in iambic pentameter. But again, with each palindromic sonnet I've written, they're all different, and they're all looking for different things. And so this one, you may notice, has no enjambment, and in fact some of the lines have 2 or 3 sentences to them. And again, that's the idea of stitching together small chunks.
So you're in many ways starting with these little, building up these library of chunks in a manner of speaking. Like, for example, just to, if I understand you correctly, so you're going to start out with, say, you've got this idea, you can write about Frankenstein in a palindrome poem of some sort. You've got, you're going through, you're finding, like, you're writing down words that are specific or, relevant to the book. So you might write, again, character names like Walton and Victor, Geneva, and so on. And maybe probably thematic things, right? Like you're probably going to write words like man or god or corpse or what have you.
Yeah.
So then you mentioned like not law. Walton backwards is not law, so that's a handy sort of pre-made one. But for something like Victor, I assume you're looking at Victor and you're thinking, okay, well backwards is rot, and then CIV. Rot's a word. CIV is not, but maybe after it could come. That could be civic.
Civilian.
It could be civilian. It ends up being civilian in this case. So you're sort of like cycling through maybe what are the possibilities in terms of like what materials, as you say, might I use to stitch together a poem the way that maybe Victor's, looking at these raw materials and trying to stitch together the monster. So what point do you decide to take things this other step of making it a sonnet or making it a Shakespearean sonnet and what have you?
Well, like I said, this is it's just the idea of combining two passions of mine, I suppose. And to write it though, you have to start at the beginning and the end at the same time, and then work towards the middle, which brings its own challenges. Because you can't. I'm trying to sort of tell the story of the novel, but I'm not writing in any sort of linear way. It's all just being, like I said, stitched together. Because, and as you pointed out, the way to do it is you have letters hanging off that you then have to satisfy on the other side. And it's very easy these days in a certain respect because you can just Google words ending in LIAN, and there you are. You'll find a website somewhere that's got a list of these words. So then you take your pick and you see what works best for what you're trying to say.
Are you trying to do this in a spreadsheet, or like are you sitting in Word like trying different things out? Like I'm curious to know like how you would actually organize all this material.
I write everything directly into Microsoft Word.
Wow.
Maybe there are easier ways. There's a sestina in my book, the palindromic sestina, which is obviously 39 lines long. I did use a table for that, because it was too unwieldy.
It's a fascinating set of methods. So but in a shorter poem, 14 lines. I mean, it's still quite hard to write a sonnet often for people to begin with. Never mind, add this level of being a palindrome to it. But as you say, you're sort of in some ways like building it from these stitched together fragments, and then you're kind of writing from both sides and meeting in the middle, and then doing whatever rewriting you have to do to kind of make that sensible and so on. Because you're still like using sentences and so on. Like there's a lot of people don't think about the constraints that are already existing in anything they try to do. Like if you talk, like the fact that you're using grammar as a constraint, which people don't think about often. As you say, like there's these unconscious constraints, whether and when you think you're being free. And I think one of the things that I find so interesting about this kind of work is how it just and when I do use constraints myself, is it just helps so much to bring to the fore those things you would otherwise maybe just automatically do. I find so much of writing personally is just not doing the automatic thing, because it's just usually not as interesting as something you could come up with. Although once in a while, you'll have that moment of inspiration or what have you. But I find for the most part, it's just a lot of slog and work, and it helps to treat things like a puzzle, as you kind of say. Now, when you're going to write the anagram version of this, so now when you've at what point would you pick a poem like this? So you write this poem, let's say, I'm going to write a Frankenstein sonnet as a palindrome. At what point do you decide to go the extra mile of rewriting it as an anagrammatic sonnet?
Oh, the anagram sonnet is its own thing, really. It's the lines are anagrams.
Oh yes, sorry.
So there is one later in the book that's two sonnets that are anagrams.
So this particular anagram sonnet, just before you read it, just to be clear, then it's a sonnet of 14 lines. Each line has the same letters in a different order.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, it's like the palindrome sonnet. It's another Shakespearean sonnet, iambic pentameter. Okay, shall I read it?
Yes, please.
One scans Prometheus. I've taken fire. A permanence of suns. I seek to thrive. From oaths uneven, take in pieces sire a creature in the mess of open knives. One notice sparks a fever in the muse. Naive, the monster faces Europe's kin. A one-time riven sun the pacts refuse, the menace spikes an overture of sin. Met, hopes see victor in a sunken fear. I'm stricken per one's avenues of hate. I speak no eve, it forces, hunts me near. Pines over ice, no sun, the maker's fate. The furnace I took passes, never mine. Time over, pauses echo, Frankenstein.
So, again, we've got a Shakespearean sonnet there, and you're anagramming it line per line. So I assume, in this case, are you actually starting with the first line, or are you starting with a different line that should then...
Well, yeah, the luxury here that you don't get with the palindrome is that you can write a series of lines and then figure out which orders to put them in.
Oh, I see, sure.
It does make it easier.
So do you remember where you started with this particular sonnet?
Well, with these kind of poems, again, I'm looking at the nouns and the important words from the novel, and I'm making sure that the set of letters I've got can include some of these words.
So Frankenstein would be an obvious one.
Frankenstein, Victor, again. I remember really wanting to make sure I could get Prometheus out of it, because there's no way I was getting Prometheus in the palindrome. So
sure.
It had to be in the anagram.
Now, maybe you didn't work precisely this way, but let's say you wanted to write a poem where you have both the word Frankenstein and the word Prometheus. Now, they don't necessarily have to be on the same line, but they've got to be in these anagrammed lines. So then, are you then sort of looking at, like, okay, if I've got Frankenstein and I've got Prometheus, what letters do they have in common? What letters do they not have in common? Like, are you sort of trying to get a vocabulary of a single line or two mapped out in that manner first before you start moving on?
Yeah, I want to, and it's good when there's an overlap of the letters, because the more phrases you can find that way. For example, if I have Prometheus and Frankenstein and there's an overlap of 4 or 5 letters, I don't know how many it is, I can't see from here, but then that means I can add more letters and more nouns, more important words, without the line ending up like 50 characters long, which would be crazy for a line that's meant to be iambic pentameter.
Sure, so they're even like the iambic pentameter as a constraint is sort of in some ways enabling you to figure out how long this line needs to be roughly, that I'm going to reconstitute, giving you sort of a limit and also like a starting point in a manner of speaking. It's got to be long enough, but also not too long.
I think it's about 25 to 35 letters is that sort of area.
And then once you have, maybe a line or two figured out in terms of, okay, this is the set of letters I'm going to work with. At that point, are you just sort of scrambling? Like, what's your process in terms of like getting the new vocabulary out of these letters? Like, how do you actually kind of move towards generating other lines?
Yeah, there's a point where you just have to commit to it, and you can have a few false starts, but once I'm about 4 lines in, I'm not going to go back and start again. I've just got to find whatever I possibly can out of the existing letters. And obviously, there's it's a long editorial process. I like to work quickly, so I like to get something down within the first session of writing. So even if that session of writing is 10 hours straight, I like to have a finished poem. But then, of course, the next day I'll go back to it, and then the day after that, for about, I don't know, a couple of months.
Wow.
And the poems keep changing all the time, and I'm still, looking at these now, thinking, I could improve that. I could change something else.
That's the danger of ever opening your own book. Somebody once asked me, like, isn't it great to read a book you've written? And I was like, I never read these books. The last thing I want to do is read this book again.
Yeah, I understand that.
If you pay me, I'll read it. Literally, you have to pay me for me to read my own book. But how many? So this is a 14-line poem, of course. But like, how many lines would you actually write in the course of putting together a 14-line poem like this?
It would probably be double, I would say.
At least, wow. Because then you're also figuring out like a sequence for them. So you may be writing them out a sequence, potentially, and then starting to figure out how they might come together, say, to make... Because in this particular poem, many of them are enjambed, moving on, or otherwise, like, you've got it 2 lines making up a sentence or what have you. Although they'll have, like from Odes Uneven, taken pieces, sire, a creature, in the mess of open knives. So those are 2 lines that maybe you wrote them around the same time, but theoretically you could have written one and then written the other, sometime apart from one another. That's interesting.
Yeah, and it's all about finding the right lines for each other as well. I mean, I think, I don't know whether with this one, but certainly with some of these, I've written some really good lines that haven't ended up in the finished poem, simply because they just didn't complement the other lines. And that's really frustrating. But there we are.
Do you do anything with those lines? Do you save them for possible future use, or do you just, kill your darlings in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, they have to go. But unless I decide to intentionally write 2 sonnets that use the same letters in each line.
Now we're just using example 2 sonnets here, but you don't always write sonnets necessarily. And also, if you're going to anagram, another way to anagram, of course, is to find a source text from elsewhere, and just reproduce that source text in some sort of anagrammatic fashion. So there's a couple of different ways people do that. So one way I've seen is, of course, let's say somebody takes Shakespeare's sonnet and they produce another sonnet where each line is anagrammed. So maybe the first line you anagram into the first line, second line you anagram into another second line, and so on. That's one way that people will approach anagrams with the source text. Another way is, say, you've got a Shakespeare sonnet, you write some other text that has anagrams that whole, as opposed to going line by line, and so on and so forth. When you're doing different kinds of anagrams, like when you're anagramming from a source text like that, however you're doing it, what are some things that you look for in a source text to figure out, this might be a good one to anagram or what have you?
That's a good question. I mean, there is one thing I've noticed, and this is something I picked up from trial and error, is that you want for a good anagram, you want about 40% of the characters to be vowels. So if you see something and it looks very consonant heavy, avoid it. And of course, then I suppose obviously as well, if it's full of Z and X and Q, then perhaps you give that a miss as well. There are the 10 most popular letters in the alphabet, if I get this right: E, T, A, O, I, N, S, H, R, L, I think.
I'm sure you're right. I always think of Wheel of Fortune, R, S, T, L, and E. But so you're looking for common letters, you're looking for a high, amount of vowels, because of course you need vowels for words in English. You're looking to maybe have not few or not many hard to use consonants. Are there other things you would maybe like? Is there like a length where an anagram becomes too difficult or maybe even too easy?
I don't know about too easy.
Maybe not.
It's surprising though. I don't think too difficult either. I think it's a strange thing that it's something we don't notice, but when you see, say, 25 or 30 letters together, a mathematician will tell you that you've got a lot of combinations there. But intuitively, when we see it, we don't realize that. It doesn't seem like there are that many options. But there really are a lot. So the longest one I've done is there's again a sestina in Stray Arts, and that's 39 lines, for which I wrote about 80 lines.
Wow.
So I feel like I could have done more as well.
Is that fairly typical that you're writing more or less twice as many lines with these poems as you're going to be able to end up using, or is it hard to say?
It depends how lucky I get, but yeah, I'd say around that many.
Now, you also invented a particular constraint poetry, I don't know if would you call it a form, or is it an operation, or what would you consider the alien drome to be?
I don't know, because I don't really know what I call anagrams and palindromes. So apart
I'm
from
not
constraint.
sure offhand, but it's constraint regardless. So, can you talk a bit about this constraint of the alien drome, what it is, and how you kind of started to find it interesting and come across it, and so on?
Yeah, well, I only started writing palindromes 10 years ago. And about 2 years into that, I was writing a palindrome about Albert Einstein. And so I was using things like sprawl warps. You can get space-time into a palindrome too, which is nice. And deep space and things like that. So lots of good words for writing about Einstein. But I was annoyed that I couldn't use the name Einstein. And so that was bugging me a bit, but, never mind. But then I can't remember how it happened exactly. I just noticed that actually if you read it backwards by every 2 letters instead of by every single letter, you get the word intense. So Einstein backwards by every 2 letters is intense, and then there's an I after that. So I thought, well, you could actually write palindromes that way. So intense, I am Einstein, is a palindrome by every 2 letters. And this is something that, since discovering that, I've been looking for elsewhere. And it seems like in 2,000 years of people writing palindromes, no one's done that before. And I don't quite believe that. I'm sure somebody must have. But anyway, after writing these what I call palindromes by pairs, the next logical step was to write them by every 3 letters or every 4 letters. And then so this led me to invent this constraint or form, or whatever we're going to call it, called the alien drome, which varies the unit of palindromism. So, for example, the phrase melody, a bloody elm, is an alendrome in the sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, because the units underpinning it are 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1. You've got the melody, M, that's the one that reflects as the last word of elm. And then EL are the next 2 letters, which are the EL of elm. And then you've got the ODY as the next unit. It's difficult to explain without writing it down. But
I think that's what you're saying, though. So now, is that varying them in that particular sort of way, what you call the alendrome? Or is the alendrome just any time you're doing a palindrome by pairs?
I consider palindromes by pairs their own thing.
Sure.
I think because the unit is still the same, whether it's 1 or 2 or 3, it's still the same. Whereas in an alendrome, the unit is changing constantly according to a premeditated numerical palindrome.
And where did you come with the name alendrome? How does that name come about?
Well, it actually came from our friend's Christian book, because I was calling these things heterogeneous palindromes as opposed to the homogeneous palindrome. And I think, Christian told me that was a bit unwieldy. So I decided, well, what about Etherin? That's okay. I think someone suggested that as well, and it appealed to my ego. And then Christian said, well, how about just your initials then, AE lindrome. So alendrome.
I like it because alien is an anagram of alien, and they seem to make a very alien, strange form. So I kind of appreciate that name. I don't know if that's an intentional thing at all, but the one I would really like you to read is geometry.
So geometry is alendromic in pi, in the first 20 digits of pi, in fact, which means that the unit varies according to these first 20 digits until we get to the 20th digit, which happens to be 4, and then the sequence reverses. So, and this is about geometry. So geometry, alendrome in pi. I nest a cone, index angles in via, a concave, pentatangential in a pit. Hypotenuse up, we closeteer phrase or line, a plane, or linear, a sphere. We close, then use up a pithy potential in a tangent cave per a convex angle. Sine, indent a cosine.
So, what's the strategy in trying to write palindromes? Do you basically approach them like a palindrome, or is there some special way that you have to approach writing in this way?
It's very much like a palindrome in that you will end up with these letters hanging off that need to be then corrected the other side. And so it is just a back and forth from between the beginning and the end. Of course, you can't find words as easily. And there are no tropes or cliches of palindromes because they only just exist. Whereas obviously with palindromes, you've got years and years of people coming up with these short phrases you can manipulate.
So just to kind of backtrack a little bit then, so one thing that, of course, a person who wants to write anagrams and palindromes could do is just read a whole bunch of them, if only because then they're going to absorb some of the tropes and be able to see like some of the common things that one can do. I know in rap music you see that all the time. Like there's like certain words that nicely like fit in places that grammatically speaking they can fit all anywhere in a sentence almost. And then additionally like there's two syllables taking up space now and so on. So there's like tropes that come out in every art form in that way. And so anagrams and palindromes have their own tropes, but it can be helpful or harmful, I guess, if you're reproducing them too much. Yeah,
it's a bit like rhyme, I think. Mm-hmm. There are lots of poems that rhyme death with breath, but it's not necessarily a bad thing if you use that because it's a good rhyme. So, those two words feel destined for each other, don't they, in a way? So it'd be a shame to avoid every cliche just because it's a cliche.
But at the same time, so on one hand, just having the background in the genre or in the form is going to help somebody write these things. Although with palindromes, maybe not so much. Are there special things that you have to do differently when trying to write an palindrome like this that has a complicated number sequence versus say a simple one?
It's actually a little bit easier writing one of these, something in pi, because among the numbers you get 9s and 8s and 7s, and having a big number is quite easy. You can just put a word in there, really. It's a lot easier than a sequence like 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3. That would, that's quite a lot harder.
And then, what attracts you about these palindromes? Is it the novelty of having to work harder in a way because there are no tropes?
That would be part of it, definitely. There's also just the ego side of it that I'm proud to have invented something, so I need to keep writing them to spread them around the world. Although I don't write that many, to be honest. I still write more palindromes than palindromes by far. So there's obviously something that's not quite as enjoyable about doing them.
Is that your favorite thing to write as a palindrome, or do you have is there some particular constraints you just like more than others?
Yeah, it's palindromes are so much fun once you get into them. And you just can't. It also becomes addictive, so it's difficult to tell what I'm doing because of it's fun and what I'm doing just because I can't help myself. I read everything backwards, and if I see something, if I see a word that I could possibly use in a palindrome, then I have to write that palindrome.
Sure.
So it's a compulsion, really.
It is really a generative thing too. I mean, one thing I think is just so useful and interesting about constraints, as I mentioned before, is they're very generative. And so often people complain to me that they have no ideas or something, or they don't, they don't have any good ideas. I'll often say to them, well, there's no difference between a good and a bad idea, really. Hamlet is a terrible idea for a play in many respects. But it's that execution that makes so much of the difference. And I always advise people, if they don't know what to write, they should open the refrigerator and write what's in their refrigerator. And if they truly don't know what to write, just list it all out. And now you've got a list poem. Give it a funky title, like "Things I'll Take, to My Grave," or whatever. Like, bare minimum, if you just have some text on a piece of paper, and then you contrast it against a title that doesn't seem to fit it, you've alienated things enough that you've got some sort of literature there, whether whether it's good or not. Once you start to add constraints, in terms of what you're putting on that page, again, you're going to automatically move into these places where it becomes more like a game or a puzzle. And I think on one hand, it's more enjoyable often for people than the pressure to say, come up with a genius idea. You're just really trying to put a puzzle together. So there's a lot less at stake emotionally, I think. And consequently, people can, maybe do a better job, ironically or paradoxically, perhaps. Now, you're also... Sorry.
I was going to say, it doesn't have to be about... perhaps puzzle is the wrong word. Perhaps it's more just about having... I think last time we spoke, you said it's about having an architecture.
Sure.
It's that. It's knowing which gaps to fill in. You've got the framework there, and then you're just doing all the work to turn it into something original.
Yeah, I think that it can. I don't always use constraints, but I certainly, if I am scheduled to write, and I just like have the flu or something, like I'll just pull like a constraint or a procedure out, and I remember the last time I had the flu and I really wanted to, like a really, really bad flu, but I was, going to try to, write anyway. I just started Googling reviews of 50 Shades of Grey, and also people complaining about conceptual poetry. And so I Googled first the phrase, "I hate conceptual poetry," thinking I would write a conceptual poem, and I couldn't turn up any results. I thought, how could this be? Surely somebody hates conceptual poetry. And then I somehow from there I just thought, well, what do people really hate? People hate that 50 Shades of Grey book. So I started like pulling together like 50 Shades of Grey reviews, and I put like "I hate conceptual poetry" as the heading, and just started I just started swapping words out. So that these bad reviews of 50 Shades of Grey became, about conceptual poetry. Because again, there's all about bondage and constraint. This person who feels like attracted to these procedures while at the same time, maybe disliking the whole experience, and so on and so forth. And I find so often like there's really fun and weird and interesting things you can generate when, as you said before, you sort of take your ego out of it, and stop like. Just acting unconsciously, but then there's a procedure and what have you. And I was just personally, I find like anytime I do kind of delve into constraints a bit more, it does have that sort of, it's a real spur to creativity. What I'll often do personally is I'll use a constraint just to generate ideas, and then I'll just drop the constraint because I'm not as interested in constraints. I'm not as much of a formalist as maybe other people would be or you would be, but I still find like. I still think I am a formalist in some levels, but then I find the constraints just to be so generative, as opposed to restrictive. And although of course they're technically restrictive.
Yeah, it's the idea again of avoiding writer's block, I suppose, avoiding not having the inspiration that hitting you, or having to rely on something external to inspire you.
Can we talk a little bit about yourself as a publisher? So you've got. So Stray Arts comes out with Penteract Press, which is your publishing company, which publishes some of your own work. You've published a number of anthologies. You've published my friend Derek Ballew. You did a book of his visual poetry from him. Can you talk a bit about Penteract Press and like how you sort of started the press and what its sort of vision is and so on, like yourself as a publisher?
Well, Penteract Press is basically, it's there to publish the kind of things I like to write and that I'm interested in, which is formalism of all kinds, really. I tend to think of the three three pillars of formalism, which are the traditional metered poetic forms, constraints, as we've discussed, and then visual poetry. And so Stray Arts features all these things. And Pen Tribe Press was set up to promote this side of poetry, where in a world that seems to be increasingly dominated by lyrical free verse. I thought it'd be fun to try to promote the other, the more structured works.
And how is it different to work as a publisher? I know it's kind of a weird and broad question, but I talk to so many people who they want to publish their own work, and I often stop them and ask, do you really though? Do you want to publish your own work and be a publisher? Or do you want to be published and be a writer? And, both can be the case, but I find often only one is the case. But as a person who's actually, interested in publishing, again, who's, doing a lot of publishing of other people, what do you think it takes distinct from the skills of writing? Like, what are the special skills you think you need or you found useful as a publisher? I don't know if that's a clear question exactly, but how is it?
It is.
Like, how has it been different from maybe what you might have expected when you were just kind of looking at it from the outside?
Well, I guess, to answer that, I have to go back to what happened when I started doing this, which was my intention was just to do leaflets, and that single fold leaflets even. So really small scale, simple things. I had no idea that we'd ever end up doing books. So that's a very cheap, easy way to get poetry out into the world. So the pressure was off then, and it was just fun. I was just experimenting with it. I didn't know that I would end up enjoying designing books as much as I have done. I was just doing it out of necessity because I wanted to publish leaflets of my poetry and of other poets whose work I admire. And then I just discovered in the process of doing that I enjoy it. I wanted a bigger challenge than just designing a leaflet. I wanted to start making books. But even then, the first book we did, which was one of mine, just a short collection of my poems from Twitter.
Is that Seller?
Yeah. Yeah, when I made that, I had no idea that we would end up shifting our focus into books entirely. That was just meant to be a one-off, just for fun. And again, it was fun, and I enjoyed it. So yeah, a couple of years ago, we decided we would shift to books exclusively. So, I guess to answer your question then, I think we were only doing it because I like designing books. And it's a lot of work getting everything right. Typesetting, and the tedium of making sure that everything's aligned correctly on every page and it's consistent. Kerning, which is a nightmare. Lots of things that you would only do it if you're really passionate about it.
Can you explain briefly what kerning is for people who don't know? Because I remember when I learned about kerning and what a nightmare it was.
Yeah. Well, I only learned about it from running the press. I didn't know about it beforehand. It's reducing the space between letters. Certain letters will look wrong in most fonts. A capital W, for example, next to a lowercase a, the gap between those two letters looks too big, so you have to manually reduce the gap. I remember when I first heard about it, I thought, who's doing that? That's that's an insane thing to do. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so now I have to pay attention to these things.
A lot of publishers will also use ligatures. Remember when I first learned about ligatures, for book design, and just baffling. Where you're sort of like, instead of an F and an I beside each other, you might have some special character that combines an F and an I with the special sort of kerning. Sometimes they'll take the kind of line that goes across in the middle of the F and push it to the I, dot of the I. And, there's all sorts of really specific, weird design issues that I don't think people don't know. Ideally, a person doesn't notice when they're reading a book, but it's nevertheless making that kind of unconscious, impression in terms of how it looks.
Yeah, and it's all there ultimately to make things clearer for the reader, whether they know it or not. Small caps, you have to increase the spacing a little bit for small caps. But there are all these things.
So how did you go about learning that stuff? Like as you kind of move towards doing some publishing projects, I think it's very useful for writers to educate themselves in terms of how publishing works, if only because if they're going to work with other publishers, they should be able to recognize what those publishers are doing and appreciate it. Send them a gift basket now and again or what have you. But I think also it's something that I think writers should learn, even if they don't ever intend to do it themselves.
I think it's helped my poetry. I really do, because poetry is such a visual thing anyway. You want, how the poem looks on the page is very important to it. So if you know a few basics of design, it really does help.
Do you find yourself writing differently because you know the design elements?
I don't know how much it changes the words, but it certainly does change how I lay the poem out.
I know that I've recently found myself rewriting almost every poem in my last book because I didn't like how it looked in print layout, because I had written the lines too long. Because I was mostly doing these free verse poems, and and I had not been paying attention. I don't tend to write lineated poems. At least in print, I tend to write a lot of them and then not print them. And I've been mostly doing like prose poetry. But then once I started to really produce a lot of these, even when I did a sonnet or a rhymed poetry, I was doing it in prose form often. Like I'd observe all the requirements, but I would just do it in prose, and then. I just didn't think to do things like just change the margins in Word, when I was composing and things like this. And I found myself rewriting a lot of it just, again, so it would look decent on the page. I didn't have like a poem that had like 20 different, hang indents in it and what have you. And I think that another thing that is just useful for writers to think about in terms of one, just to be educated about what publishers are doing and what it looks good or is like a normal thing to happen in a book. I think another thing that's kind of useful is if people are thinking about self-publishing in any sort of way, whether as a large scale thing they're going to just take into their hands, or something they're going to do on occasion with special projects. I think it helps to really just have like an education in there. But I think it's hard to find that education. Like, what did you do to sort of determine, like, to learn more about publishing?
Well, it's all been learned as I go, and I've realised there is a lot. There's a lot you have to know and a lot you have to do. You can do a sort of self-publishing print on demand. You could take that path, but I don't think many people are buying those books. Well, it probably depends on the nature of the book. I'm not sure if a lot of poetry sells that way.
Well, I think you're certainly you don't like doing a hardcover book like this it's possible to do in print on demand, but it's harder to do in a manner, and it often doesn't look well. Like print on demand tech has gotten pretty good. I was sent recently an Oxford University Press book that I already owned, and I knew the second I got it that they were using print on demand. Now it was very good, but it was still like they had gone from printing books to doing print on demand books for whatever reason. A lot of larger presses are doing this now for their backlists after they run a print run out. They don't necessarily want to do a new print run, but they still want to have the book in print, say. So even though the tech has gotten very, very good, I still had that moment where I could tell instantly, like unconsciously and instantly, I could tell the difference. But I don't think most people could. It's definitely improved. Yeah. Yeah, like there's certain tells if you actually were to look at it. Like there's a barcode in a certain place and so on. But doing a hardcover is something that's very, very hard to do still well on print on demand. Whereas like paperbacks have gotten better and better. And so in many ways, it sounds like just sort of taking the project on and like just forcing yourself to kind of learn what you don't know to make the thing as good as it possibly could be is maybe the path. Like that kind of learning through doing, just as I suppose you've learned to write these types of poems.
Yeah, I mean, it's I have to draw the distinction between self-publishing and publishing through your own press.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
because
a very different distinction. Yeah,
there's obviously a lot more work that way around, as I found. Because when I first started writing poetry, I self-published some books on Amazon, and that was a lot easier. But then in setting up a press and going through all the work that entails, and there's no time to go into it all now. But yeah, there's a lot to do. You've got to find distribution. You've got to register every book. And then we sell most of our books through our own website. So I spend a lot of time packaging things up, which is not something I ever thought I'd spend this much time doing.
Could you talk a bit about where can people go to find your website and the press's website?
It's penteractpress.com. So it's PENTERACT press.com.
And the Stray Arts is available there. You've got books. Is your bookseller still in print?
It is, yeah. And we currently have 9 books published by Pentract Press. We're still selling our leaflets, but they're not for long.
I really suggest people read or look at, depending on how you want to say, Aperture by Derek Beaulieu. I really love that book in particular. Yeah. You did a brilliant job with that book. It's a beautifully done book, and the colors are so vibrant.
It is, yeah. I was so proud of that edition, and the printers did a really good job. That the colors just stand out, don't they?
Cellar as well has a really great the cover really pops in particular with that book, and this book has Stray Arts has a really Stray Arts, by the way, the title is itself is a palindrome, in case you know. Yeah. And
I'm obsessed.
Yeah, and and then the other place that people, of course, can find more about you and see samples of your work is your Twitter feed, where you publish a lot of your poetry as well, which is what?
That's Anthony_Etherin.
Anthony_Etherin on Twitter, and penteractpress.com.
Yeah, we're on Twitter as well at Pentract Press. No underscore.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for talking to me, and it's really some exciting work that you're doing, and I appreciate how you kind of have broken down into some very kind of practical ways somebody can approach what I think a lot of people look at a book like this, which is a lot of work and does take quite a large amount of skill to produce, but maybe find it as foreboding and don't know necessarily how they could start doing something like this. But so I think it's helpful to really kind of break it down in those kind of practical ways for somebody who's maybe wants to try it out but is intimidated.
Yeah, well, I hope so. Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
All right. Well, thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and keep writing the wrong way.